Last time I was here, I was speaking on Psalm 19. And I think it's very fitting, as I come to speak this morning, that I pray the words that are at the end of that psalm. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart and all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my Redeemer. There are many different ways of starting a sermon, and some preachers can be depended upon to always start their sermon in the same way every time they speak. I've known some who've always started by telling a joke. I'm not going to do that. Others would always start off with a story. Not going to do that. Yet others could be counted upon to read the Bible verse they wanted to speak on or wanted people to think about. Now, I've actually done all of those three, and this morning I'm going to read a Bible verse. And it's a Bible verse where Jesus asked people a question. It's only found actually in Mark's Gospel, and it's in Mark's Gospel chapter 8 and verse 36. And in the King James Version, which I think most of us are very familiar with, it reads like this: "For what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" I like the way the New International Version puts it, though, because it says, "What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and forfeit their soul?" And then again, the Living Bible translation gives a slightly different nuance to it. It says, "And how does a man benefit if he gains the whole world and loses his soul in the process?" King Solomon was known for his wisdom and his proverbs. The book entitled Proverbs in the Bible was mostly written by Solomon and contains many words of wisdom. And there are many people today who read one chapter of Proverbs every day, 31 chapters and 31 days in most months. And they do that every month. So they read the book of Proverbs 12 times every year. I commend it to you. It's worthwhile to do that. Then again, towards the end of his life, Solomon puts pen to paper, or rather what the equivalent was in his day, at that time, many hundreds of years before Christ. He writes the book called Ecclesiastes. And in it, Solomon takes us on a journey as he reflects on his life. He writes about everything he had in his life. He had wisdom, he had riches, he had women, plenty of them, he had power, everything that many people crave for today. The name of the book in our Bible is Ecclesiastes, and it comes from the Greek word meaning preacher. And in the Hebrew Bible, it is entitled The Words of the Preacher. I think that's a far better title than Ecclesiastes. But, in fact, the words of the word preacher or teacher in this book could be interchangeable. Both are, as it were, acceptable as a translation. So the words of the preacher, the words of the teacher. The book of Ecclesiastes also is one of the most puzzling books in the Old Testament and is considered by some to be the most melancholy, gloomy, and miserable books in the Bible. If it's that depressing, why should I want to read it? Well, one of the reasons is because of the teaching and the message that it brings. I wondered why I wanted to look into this book this morning. And as I thought about it, about what I was going to say this morning, I kept coming back to this book. So this is why I'm taking some thoughts from it. But it's a book that a Christian should not ignore. Do you know, in our materialistic society, our society where many people seek riches, we see it all the time, don't we? They chase after sex and they chase after power and every other thing that people crave today. That's what our society is. There's a great need to understand the basic message that is in Ecclesiastes. We read that Solomon came to the conclusion that life itself is useless, irrational, pointless, foolish, empty, until he learned that it was only that if God was left out of our lives. The message of Ecclesiastes is everything. It's that everything apart from God is empty, hollow, and meaningless. Exclude God from life, and life has no real meaning or point. Earlier this week, somebody was in our house and over the meal table. They told us about someone, a local young man, who told a Christian who had knocked on his door to invite him to church. This young man said that his life had no meaning or purpose, but he added that this fact troubled him greatly. As the saying goes, the young man had worked hard and played hard up to that time in his life, and he'd done very well for himself, but was unsatisfied. The Christian man introduced him to Jesus. And in time, this young man asked Jesus into his heart. And that young man's life changed. He now has purpose. The futility had gone. Why? Jesus brought meaning into his meaningless life. He was recently baptized here in Warrington. Jesus wants to bring meaning into all our lives. Let's look at some of the things that Solomon wrote. In Ecclesiastes 1 and verses 1 to 3, we read this: "The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." God, what a thing. What do people gain from all their labours at which they toil under the sun? Have you ever thought that as you've been at work? This meaningless could be summed up in 3 statements. 1, nothing seems to change. Verses 4 to 7, generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun sets, and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. Nothing seems to change. And the second thing is that nothing seems to satisfy. Verse 8, all things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. Nothing seems to satisfy. And 3, nothing is new under the sun. Verses 9 and 10. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new. It is here already, long ago. It was here before our time. And so Solomon is saying, nothing seems to change, nothing seems to satisfy, nothing is new under the sun. And Solomon then goes on in chapters 1 and 2 to talk about where people search for satisfaction and happiness in life. For some, it's simply to study, to gain wisdom and gain knowledge and gain a position in life. For some, it's simply the pursuit of pleasure of one sort or another. For some, it's sort of just getting on with life and really having no purpose. And Solomon calls that folly. Then there are others where their work is the be-all and end-all of their life. Do any of these describe how you feel and your lifestyle today? Everything is meaningless, writes King Solomon. Wisdom is meaningless. Pleasure is meaningless. Wisdom and folly are meaningless. Work is meaningless. Everything is meaningless. No wonder it's said it's the most depressing book in the Bible. But then Solomon writes these words in verses 12 to 18. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ever ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned too that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Satisfaction and happiness are not found in the acquisition of wisdom. Trying to do so is like chasing after the wind. In chapter 2 and verses 1 to 3, he said, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what good for people. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their life. And here we see that Solomon is basically saying, look, satisfaction and happiness are not found in worldly pleasures. Then in verse 4 to 6, he said, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. And basically, Solomon is saying, look, I did all these things. He's known for some of the marvelous buildings that he put up. We talk about the magnificence of Solomon's temple, and there are so many other remains of what Solomon built. Yes, he built, but he says satisfaction and happiness are not to be found in work. And then in verses 7 to 11, he said, I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all of this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Solomon is saying satisfaction is not found in having great possessions. Pursuing such things is like chasing after the wind. And then in verses 24 and 26 of chapter 2, Solomon tells us what he has concluded about life. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? Let's repeat that. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. You'll notice there that Solomon divides people into two groups. One, those who please God, and secondly, sinners. The young man I told you about earlier, who'd moved from being a sinner to being a man who pleased God. All the things that people strive for are there for us as a gift from God to those who seek to put him first in their lives and to please him. He gives us our food and drink. He makes our work satisfying, and we will be able to find life enjoyable. Today, do you feel that you are chasing after the wind of wisdom and knowledge, the wind of working, the wind of pleasure, or the wind of some hobby, or all of which leave you no time, no room for God and the work that God has for you to do? Have you left God out of the aspects of your life? I come back to today's Bible verse. In the Amplified Bible, we read this: "For what does it benefit a man to gain the whole world with all its pleasures and forfeit his soul?" Something for us to think about, isn't it? In the late 1950s, a well-known singer-songwriter called Pete Seeger put the first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes 3 to music. And he just added a few words to complete the song. The first recorded version, I'm told, came out in 1962 by a group that I've never heard of called the Limelighters. And it came out under the title, Everything is There, to Everything There is a Season. And then in 1965, and I remember this, the versions were sung by a group called the Byrds, spelt B-Y-R-D-S, not B-I-R-D-S. And it became a huge hit and reached the #1 spot in the chart. And I remember it well. It was actually a protest song against war. These are the words that King Solomon wrote, and over 2,500 years later, Pete Seeger put to music. And you'll know them. There is a time for everything, a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. There's a time for everything, something I'm often reminded of. We often get our timings wrong, but God's timing is perfect. I'm going to read things that the Apostle Paul wrote about that are found in the letters he sent to Titus, to the Ephesian church, to the churches in Galatia, the Christians in Rome, and to the Corinthian church. To Titus he wrote this: "At one time we too were foolish, disobedient, deceived, and enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures. We lived in malice and envy, being hated and hating one another." We could ask the question today, are you enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures? To the Ephesian church, he wrote this: "Remember, at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world." Today, are you without hope and without God in this world? To the Galatian churches, he wrote, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law." And to the Romans, he wrote, "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly." Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And to the Corinthians, he wrote, "And as God's co-workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. For he says, 'In the time of my favor, I heard you. In the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favour. Now is the day of salvation. Are you like that young man I told you about earlier, who needed to come to Christ to find fulfilment in his life? Has the chasing after the wind of money, of work, status, or in the accumulation of things left you without God in the right place in your life? Or, indeed, without God in your life at all? Well, today can be that day, the time to change all that. Today can be your day of salvation if you ask Jesus to come into your heart and life. To the Hebrews was written these words: "Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." In our lives, we all have times of need. Do you have a time of need, particularly today? Is today a time of need in your life? Do you need to know that you are right with God? Can God say that you are pleasing to him? He wants, as Solomon wrote, to give you wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. He does not want your life to be meaningless. He wants to bless you. Again, Paul wrote to the church in Corinth these words in chapter 9, 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 8, "And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work." We just look briefly at parts of the first 3 chapters of Ecclesiastes, but there are 9 further chapters of Solomon's thoughts and reflections on life and on God, our Creator. The whole book of Ecclesiastes is well worth a read because of what he says about man's relationship with God and what man's relationship with God should be. And this is particularly so in chapter 5. We're told 3 things. 1, that we're to stand in awe of God. 2, we're to listen to what he has to say to us. And then 3, make sure we keep any promises we make to him. Sadly, so often we fail to do these 3 things, and we need to be reminded of them. After much consideration, Solomon sets out his final conclusion in the 12th chapter of Ecclesiastes in verse 13 and 14. And he says this: "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil." May it be our desire and aim to follow the great King Solomon's wise conclusions, to turn from the meaningless of chasing after the various winds that men chase after, to fearing God and keeping his commandments.